Picture this, a fortress rising from the mist along the banks of the Thames, its ancient stones darkened by centuries of rain and shadow. Above, the sky churns with storm clouds, and the air carries the haunting calls of ravens, the legendary guardians said to hold the fate of the kingdom in their wings. For nearly 1,000 years, the Tower of London has stood as a silent witness to some of history's most dramatic and chilling moments. It has been a royal palace, a feared prison, and the stage for executions that shaped the course of England itself. But beyond its imposing walls and storied past lies something even more compelling: whispers. Whispers of those who never left, whose stories are etched into the very fabric of this place. What if these stones could talk? What would they reveal about the lives and deaths that echo through its passageways? From the tragic tale of Anne Boleyn, who met her end on the executioner's block, to the two young princes who vanished within its confines, the tower is more than a monument. It is a repository of restless souls. Its history is written not just in records and ledgers, but in the lingering presence of those who walked its corridors in moments of triumph, terror, and despair. These are not just ghost stories, they are fragments of real lives, real sorrows, and unanswered questions that continue to captivate historians, visitors, and paranormal enthusiasts alike. Every corner of this fortress seems to pulse with memory, from the bloody tower to the Traitor's Gate, each stone holding secrets waiting to be uncovered. In this video, we're embarking on a journey into the heart of one of the world's most haunted historical sites. We'll walk in the footsteps of kings and prisoners, explore the legends that refuse to fade, and meet the phantom residents said to still roam these grounds. Whether you're drawn by history, mystery, or the thrill of the supernatural, there's something here that will stir your imagination and perhaps send a shiver down your spine. So settle in and let's step together into the shadows of the Tower of London, where the past feels vividly, eerily alive. Perhaps no story from the tower's long history tugs at the heartstrings more than the tragic tale of the two young princes. In the spring of 1483, 12-year-old King Edward V and his 9-year-old brother, Richard, the Duke of York, were brought to the Tower of London. Officially, they were being prepared for Edward's coronation, a moment of great celebration that would secure the young king's reign. But this was not a place of honor for them, it was a gilded cage. Their own uncle, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, had placed them there, swiftly moving to declare the boys illegitimate and seizing the crown for himself as King Richard III. The boys were moved from the royal apartments into far more secure quarters, and then they simply vanished from the historical record. They were never seen alive again. The most widely accepted theory is that they were murdered on the orders of their uncle to secure his hold on the throne, a ruthless act that would cast a long and dark shadow over his reign. Their suspected fate was so shocking that it reverberated through the centuries, a potent symbol of the cold brutality of power. It's a story that feels less like history and more like a Shakespearean tragedy, full of betrayal, ambition, and the loss of innocence. For generations, the mystery of what truly happened to them has remained one of England's greatest unsolved crimes, and many believe the princes never truly left the tower. Their spirits, it is said, are trapped in the place where they spent their final, terrifying days. The most common reports describe two small, sorrowful figures dressed in white nightshirts. They are often seen holding hands, a heartbreaking detail that speaks to their fear and their bond in the face of an unthinkable ordeal. Witnesses describe an overwhelming atmosphere of dread and profound sadness that accompanies their apparitions, a feeling of cold despair that seems to cling to the ancient stones. They are most frequently glimpsed in the Bloody Tower, the building where they were allegedly held, but their quiet weeping has also been heard echoing through the cavernous hall of the White Tower. These are not aggressive or threatening phantoms. They are lost, frightened children, their energy forever imprinted on the location by the violence and betrayal that ended their short lives. The emotion reported by those who have seen them is not one of horror, but of deep empathy and sorrow. It's as if the very stones of the tower weep for them, preserving their memory and their plea for justice across the centuries. Their story is the emotional core of the tower's haunted reputation, a lingering whisper of a wrong that has never been righted. But the mystery of their fate only deepens when we ask the pivotal question: who gave the order? For centuries, the prime suspect has been their uncle, King Richard III, immortalized by Shakespeare as a monstrous hunchback who stopped at nothing to secure his throne. The traditional narrative is compelling in its simplicity. Richard had the most to gain from their deaths. Without the boys, his claim was unchallenged and the path to his coronation was clear. Yet, some historians have begun to question this long-held belief, pointing out that the most damning accounts of Richard's villainy were written under the reign of his successors, the Tudors, who had a vested interest in painting him as a merciless usurper. This opens the door to other compelling suspects, figures who also stood to benefit from the vacuum of power. One such figure is Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. A powerful noble and initially one of Richard's key supporters, Buckingham had his own claim to the throne and orchestrated a major rebellion against the king just months after the princes vanished. Could he have ordered the murders to destabilize Richard's reign and create an opportunity for himself? The web of ambition and betrayal surrounding the boys is thick with possibilities, making their story not just a tale of royal tragedy, but a centuries-old cold case with multiple plausible perpetrators. This historical whodunit found a shocking and tangible piece of evidence nearly 200 years later. In 1674, during renovations to a staircase leading to the chapel in the White Tower, workers made a grisly discovery. Buried roughly 10 feet under the stone steps, they found a wooden chest containing the skeletons of 2 children. The sizes were estimated to match the ages of the 2 princes at the time of their disappearance. The bones were jumbled together, and the location itself was telling: a hidden, shallow grave within the very walls of their prison. The discovery sent a wave of excitement and horror through London. The remains were widely accepted as those of the lost princes, and by order of King Charles II, they were given a proper royal burial in Westminster Abbey, where they rest today under a marble monument. While modern science has been unable to conclusively prove the identity of the skeletons, their discovery cemented the tragic fate of the boys in the public imagination, transforming a historical rumor into a story with physical, heartbreaking evidence. This tangible link to their violent end is precisely why so many believe their spirits cannot rest. The spectral sightings of the 2 small figures are not just random ghost stories. They are echoes of a confirmed trauma that occurred in a specific, identifiable location. The emotional resonance of their story, the betrayal, the fear, the innocence lost is so powerful that it seems to have permanently imprinted itself on the atmosphere of the tower. The feeling of profound sadness reported by visitors near the White Tower and the Bloody Tower isn't merely a symptom of a spooky environment. It feels directly connected to the discovery of those small bones hidden away for centuries, a silent testament to a terrible secret. The ghosts and the history are inextricably linked, one providing an emotional and supernatural weight to the other, making the legend of the princes one of the most poignant and enduring hauntings in the entire world. Yet if the tragedy of the princes represents stolen innocence, the story of Anne Boleyn is one of fiery ambition extinguished by the cold steel of a blade. From the moment she captured the heart of King Henry VIII, Anne's life became a high-stakes drama that would forever alter the course of English history. Her refusal to become merely the king's mistress, her demand for the crown itself, set in motion the cataclysmic break from the Catholic Church and the establishment of a new religious order. For a brief, glorious period, she was the most powerful woman in England, a queen who presided over a court buzzing with intellectual and artistic energy. But the very passion and defiance that made her so captivating to the king would also seal her fate. After 3 years of marriage and the birth of only one healthy daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, Henry's desperate desire for a male heir turned his devotion into impatience and then into something far darker. Her fall from grace was as swift and brutal as her rise had been. Arrested on charges so outlandish they defy belief: treason, adultery with 5 men, and even incest with her own brother, Anne was transported to the Tower of London not as a queen but as a condemned prisoner. Her trial was a sham, a foregone conclusion orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, to clear the path for Henry to marry Jane Seymour. Found guilty by a jury that included her own uncle, Anne was sentenced to die. In a final, bizarre act of mercy, or perhaps cruel irony, Henry granted her wish for an execution by sword rather than axe and sent to Calais for an expert French swordsman to perform the gruesome task. On the morning of May 19, 1536, she walked onto the scaffold at Tower Green, delivered a graceful speech praising the king, and knelt in the straw. With a single, silent stroke, it was over. Her body and head were placed in an arrow chest and buried in an unmarked grave beneath the altar of the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula. It is this profound injustice, this shocking violence against a woman who once reshaped a nation, that many believe anchors her spirit so firmly to the tower. Unlike the classic headless horror of so many folk tales, Anne Boleyn's apparition is most often reported as strikingly complete and dignified. She is frequently described as a pale woman in a dark, elegant Tudor-era gown, often wearing a French hood, pacing the walkways of the Queen's house, or appearing as a silent, sorrowful presence in the rooms of the White Tower where she was imprisoned. But her most famous and chilling manifestation is the full ghostly procession witnessed on the anniversary of her execution. Spectral figures dressed in Tudor clothing are said to lead a silent, glowing parade down the aisle of the Chapel Royal. At the front walks a woman bearing an uncanny resemblance to Anne, who proceeds to the altar where she is buried before the entire assembly vanishes into nothingness. These sightings suggest a spirit not defined by her brutal death, but eternally connected to the place of her greatest humiliation and suffering. She is not a monster but a memory, a restless soul forever replaying the final traumatic chapters of her life. The energy she left behind seems to be one of profound injustice, a powerful emotional residue that has not dissipated with the passing of centuries. Her ghost is a permanent reminder of the brutal price of power and the fragility of favor in the court of a tyrant king, a presence that ensures her story and her name will never be forgotten. But Anne's spectral presence is not always one of quiet sorrow. It is also intertwined with a far more ominous legend. Beyond the poignant sightings, her ghost is deeply feared as a harbinger of doom, a phantom whose appearance is believed to foretell disaster, particularly for the British royal family. This belief transforms her from a mere tragic figure into an active, supernatural portent, a restless spirit whose emergence from the shadows is a warning of impending calamity. This aspect of her legend speaks to the profound and unsettling impact her death had on the national consciousness, a mark so deep that her ghost became synonymous with the very concept of a cursed monarchy. One of the most chilling and well-documented accounts that fuels this belief occurred in the 19th century and involved a lone guardsman on his nightly patrol. The soldier was making his rounds near the Queen's house, the very building where Anne was held before her execution, when he spotted a strange glow emanating from an upper window. As he watched, a figure appeared, a woman dressed in a black, antiquated gown that seemed to shimmer with an unearthly light. She stood motionless for a moment before beginning to descend a set of stairs that led directly toward him. Following strict protocol, the guardsman challenged the figure, demanding she identify herself. Instead of halting, the glowing woman continued her advance, moving with an eerie, silent grace directly toward his bayonet. In a state of escalating terror, the soldier charged at the figure with his weapon, only to watch in utter horror as the bayonet passed straight through her ethereal form. The apparition continued forward, seemingly unfazed, and passed directly through the man himself. The experience was so violently shocking that the guardsman immediately collapsed into unconsciousness. When he was discovered later, he was of course charged with the serious military offense of falling asleep on his post. Facing a court-martial and potential disgrace, the soldier steadfastly maintained his incredible story, describing the woman in intricate detail, a description that veteran Tower staff immediately recognized as matching the traditional appearance of Anne Boleyn. His life and career hung in the balance until, remarkably, his story was corroborated by several independent witnesses. Other guardsmen came forward to confess they, too, had seen the same phantom woman on the grounds but had been too afraid of ridicule or reprimand to report it. With this testimony, the accused soldier was acquitted, and the official record of the tower was permanently marked with a supernatural encounter that could not be explained away. This story is so powerful because it moves beyond a simple sighting. It involves a direct, aggressive interaction with the phantom, an encounter that had real-world consequences for a living person and left an indelible mark on the institution's own historical log. This idea of Anne as an omen is powerfully reinforced by her reported appearances at pivotal moments of royal crisis. She was allegedly seen walking the halls of the Tower in the lead up to the execution of King Charles I in 1649, an event that shook the very foundation of the monarchy. Most notably, during both World Wars, sentries and residents within the Tower grounds reported a surge in sightings of her restless spirit. It was as if the immense national trauma and the threat to the kingdom itself had stirred her from her centuries-long slumber, drawing her forth to manifest as a silent witness to renewed turmoil. Her ghost becomes a barometer for national anxiety, a spectral symbol that appears when the fate of the nation hangs in the balance. This recurring theme connects her personal tragedy directly to the health of the crown itself, suggesting that the injustice of her death created a wound in the fabric of the monarchy that has never fully healed, and her spirit serves as its eternal, painful reminder. While the story of Anne Boleyn is one of a queen brought down by her own ambition, the tale of Lady Jane Grey is perhaps even more heartbreaking, a narrative of an innocent teenager crushed by the ruthless machinery of power. In the turbulent summer of 1553, the 15-year-old Jane found herself at the center of a deadly dynastic struggle. She was a brilliant and devout young woman, renowned for her scholarly intellect, but she was also a pawn in the grand political game orchestrated by her powerful father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland. Upon the death of the young King Edward VI, Northumberland manipulated the succession to bypass the king's half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, and instead place his daughter-in-law, Jane, on the throne. Her bloodline was royal. She was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, but her claim was weak, and her desire for the crown was virtually non-existent. Historical accounts describe her as horrified when she was told of the plan, collapsing into tears and declaring the true successor should be Mary. But the will of powerful men prevailed, and against her own will, she was proclaimed Queen of England. Her reign lasted a mere 9 days. The English populace, loyal to the Tudor line, overwhelmingly supported the eldest daughter of Henry VIII, Mary Tudor. As Mary's forces marched on London, Jane's support evaporated. The council that had so recently sworn allegiance to her swiftly turned coat, declaring for Mary. Jane was swiftly deposed, stripped of the title she never wanted, and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Initially, she was treated with some respect, housed in the gentleman jailer's apartments. Many, including Jane herself, likely believed she would be pardoned. She was, after all, an unwilling participant in the plot, a young girl used by the adults around her. But her fate was sealed by the actions of her father, who foolishly joined a rebellion against Queen Mary. This act of treason made Jane too dangerous to live. She was tried for high treason, found guilty, and sentenced to die. On a cold February morning in 1554, just 17 years old, Lady Jane Grey was led out to the scaffold on Tower Green. Witnesses reported her composure as staggering. Blindfolded, she could not find the executioner's block with her hands. In a moment of pure terror and heartbreaking vulnerability, she cried out, "What shall I do?" "Where is it?" A guide helped her hands to the block, and with a single stroke her life was ended. Her final words were a quiet recitation of a psalm, a testament to the profound faith that had sustained her through her unimaginable ordeal. In death, she became a symbol of innocent sacrifice, a life extinguished not for anything she had done, but for the blood she possessed and the ambitions of others. It is this overwhelming sense of wasted youth and profound injustice that seems to have left an indelible mark on the tower's atmosphere. Her apparition is not one of rage or terror, but of pure, distilled sorrow. She is most often reported as a faint, white, shimmering figure, almost translucent, seen on the anniversary of her execution near the site of the scaffold on Tower Green. Unlike the more solid apparitions of other tower phantoms, Jane seems to be made of light and mist, a fleeting impression of a soul too gentle for the brutal world she inhabited. Witnesses describe a feeling of sudden, deep melancholy that accompanies her appearance, a wave of sadness that seems to come from nowhere and then vanish as quickly as she does. The most poignant reports describe not just a silent figure, but a full re-enactment of her final moments. Some have claimed to see the faint, glowing outline of a young woman kneeling, accompanied by the phantom sound of an axe falling, though no one is there. This spectral echo suggests a trauma so intense that it replaying itself annually, a haunting memory etched into the very fabric of time and space at the tower. Her ghost does not threaten or interact with the living. It simply is a silent, sorrowful embodiment of a life cut brutally short. In a place filled with the spirits of kings and queens, warriors and traitors, the ghost of Lady Jane Grey remains one of the most affecting, a timeless reminder of the human cost of the thirst for power. While the stories of tragic queens and lost princes dominate the lore of the tower, the spirit of a very different kind of historical figure is also said to linger within its walls, that of the famed explorer, soldier, and poet Sir Walter Raleigh. His presence introduces a different kind of haunting, one not of a sudden, violent end, but of a brilliant life slowly eroded by years of confinement. Raleigh was a quintessential Renaissance man, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, whom he famously charmed by laying his cloak over a puddle for her. He was a privateer who fought the Spanish, a visionary who sponsored the first English colonies in the New World, and a writer of considerable talent. But the death of his patron, Queen Elizabeth, and the ascension of King James I of England, who sought peace with Spain, signaled the end of Raleigh's golden age. Viewed as a dangerous provocateur by the new king, Raleigh was arrested, convicted of treason in a sham trial, and thrown into the Tower of London in 1603. He was not immediately executed. Instead, King James commuted his sentence to life imprisonment, beginning a 13-year stretch of captivity that would break a lesser man. Yet, Raleigh was not entirely broken. He was housed in relatively comfortable quarters, even allowed his family to live with him, and it was during this long imprisonment that he undertook his most ambitious intellectual project, writing a vast, sprawling work titled The History of the World. This monumental tome, intended as a gift for the young Prince Henry, was a profound meditation on power, fate, and the lessons of the past, written from a room with a view of the execution site where so many had met their end. For a time, it seemed he might live out his days as a scholar prisoner, but King James, desperate for treasure and still eager to rid himself of this troublesome figure, eventually released him on one condition. He was to lead an expedition to South America to find the legendary city of gold, El Dorado. The mission was a catastrophic failure. Not only did Raleigh fail to find any gold, but his men attacked a Spanish outpost against the king's explicit orders, an act that violated the fragile peace James had cultivated. His own son, Wat, was killed in the fighting, Returning to England in disgrace and with the Spanish ambassador demanding his head, Sir Walter Raleigh's fate was sealed. His original death sentence was reinstated, and on October 29, 1618, he was led to the scaffold at the Old Palace Yard in Westminster. He met his end with characteristic courage and wit, even jesting about the sharpness of the axe. His long, torturous relationship with the Tower of London was finally over. But many believe a part of him never left. His ghost is one of the most frequently and clearly seen apparitions within the fortress. He is described as a tall, imposing figure with a distinctive pointed beard, dressed in the rich, elaborate attire of the Elizabethan era, a doublet, ruff, and cape. He is not a frantic or sorrowful spirit like some others. His presence is often described as calm but intensely restless. He is most commonly seen pacing the rooms of the Bloody Tower, where he was held during his first imprisonment, and the more spacious quarters he later inhabited with his family. Witnesses report the sound of slow, measured footsteps echoing in empty corridors, and the sight of this spectral figure pausing to look out of the same windows from which he once gazed upon a world he could no longer explore. This haunting feels uniquely psychological. Raleigh's spirit does not seem to be reenacting a moment of death, but rather the agonizing, slow passage of time that defined over a dozen years of his life. His ghost is the embodiment of frustrated potential and intellectual confinement. The man who once sailed uncharted oceans and founded new worlds was reduced to walking the same few feet of stone floor. His great mind turned inward to write history because he could no longer make it. His apparition, forever pacing, suggests a soul that even in death cannot break free from the rhythms of his long captivity, eternally trapped within the stone walls that both protected and caged him. He is a reminder that a prison can be a state of mind as much as a physical space, and that for a spirit as vast and ambitious as Raleigh's, those confines may have been the cruelest sentence of all. If the story of Lady Jane Grey is a tragedy of youthful innocence, then the fate of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, is a harrowing tale of aged resilience shattered by pure, unadulterated terror. At 67 years old, she was one of the oldest and most respected nobles to be executed within the Tower's walls, a woman whose life was intertwined with the very fabric of the royal family, only to be torn apart by its most tyrannical king. She was the last direct descendant of the Plantagenet line, a dynasty that had ruled England before the Tudors, and that bloodline made her family a perpetual threat in the paranoid eyes of Henry VIII. For years, she had managed to survive the king's mercurial moods, even serving as governess to his daughter, the future Queen Mary. But the perceived treachery of her son, Cardinal Reginald Pole, who wrote condemning tracts against Henry from the safety of Europe, sealed her fate. The aging countess was arrested on charges of treason, stripped of her titles, and brought to the Tower, a prisoner of a king who would tolerate no dissent, real or imagined. The morning of May 27, 1541, was meant to be a swift administration of royal justice. Instead, it descended into one of the most gruesome and chaotic spectacles ever witnessed on Tower Green. The elderly Margaret was led to the scaffold, a woman who had known a lifetime of privilege and piety, now facing the block. There was no experienced swordsman from Calais for her. A common headsman with an axe was tasked with the job, a man who was clearly unprepared for the horror to come. As she was forced to kneel and position her head, a primal survival instinct must have taken over. Perhaps she heard the crowd's gasp or caught a glimpse of the executioner's nervous stance. Whatever the reason, at the crucial moment, she suddenly rose from the block and fled across the scaffold, a 67-year-old woman running for her life in a final, desperate act of defiance. What followed was a scene of pure butchery. The executioner, now panicked and enraged, pursued her. He brought his axe down not with a single, clean stroke, but with a series of wild, hacking blows, striking her shoulders, her skull, and her back as she tried to evade him. The green was splattered with blood as the horrified audience watched this dignified noblewoman being literally chopped to death. It was not an execution, it was a massacre. The violence was so extreme, so shockingly brutal, that it left an indelible stain of horror on the very ground where it occurred, a memory so powerful it seems to have permanently scarred the location itself. It is this unimaginable trauma, this final moments of sheer, unadulterated terror and violence, that many believe her spirit is condemned to relive. Her ghost is not a peaceful, sorrowful presence like Lady Jane Grey's, nor a dignified procession like Anne Boleyn's. The apparition of Margaret Pole is one of pure, unrestrained panic and agony. On the anniversary of her death, witnesses have reported a spectral reenactment of that bloody day so vivid it chills the soul. The air grows suddenly cold, and the sound of frantic, scrambling footsteps can be heard echoing on the stones, though no one is there to see them. Then the apparition itself appears, not a full-bodied figure, but a frantic, blurred form of an elderly woman in Tudor dress, screaming silently as she flees from an unseen pursuer. The most terrifying reports describe not just the visual phantom, but the accompanying auditory hallucinations. Visitors and staff have claimed to hear the sickening, wet thuds of an axe striking flesh and bone, a ghastly sound that seems to come from the empty air, followed by a wave of overwhelming dread and the metallic scent of blood. This is a haunting that engages all the senses, a full sensory nightmare that forces witnesses to experience a fraction of the Countess's final, horrific moments. It is a haunting defined not by sadness but by raw, visceral fear. Her spirit does not walk, it runs. It does not mourn, it screams. The energy left behind is one of ultimate violation and terror, a psychic wound on the landscape so deep that it continues to bleed through the centuries, ensuring that the brutal death of Margaret Pole is never, ever forgotten. Though the stories of famous residents like Anne Boleyn and Walter Raleigh echo through the tower's larger spaces, one of its most intimate and chilling haunted locations is a place where history was literally carved into the walls. The Beauchamp Tower served as a prison for high-ranking nobles and clergymen, men of education and status who were left for months or even years in cold, damp cells with little more than their own thoughts for company. In their desperation and boredom, many turned to the soft limestone walls around them, using nails, knives, or other makeshift tools to etch their names, family coats of arms, intricate symbols, and poignant messages. This graffiti is not vandalism. It is a heartbreaking archive of anguish, a direct line to the minds of men who lived and died within these confines, never knowing if they would see the outside world again. Walking into the Beauchamp Tower today is like stepping into a museum of quiet despair, where every scratch on the wall tells a story of hope, faith, and fear. Perhaps the most famous and emotionally resonant of these carvings was made by John Dudley, the eldest of the 5 brothers imprisoned here after the failed plot to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. Their father, the Duke of Northumberland, and Jane herself had already been executed, and the brothers awaited their own seemingly inevitable death sentences. In this atmosphere of sheer terror, John Dudley carved a poignant symbol into the stone, a single-framed grapevine winding and leafy with the name Jane clearly visible at its center. This was not a random doodle, it was a coded message of grief and loyalty. The grapevine was the heraldic badge of the Dudley family, and placing Jane's name within it was a bold declaration of their shared cause and his profound sorrow for the young queen he had served and whose fate was tied to his own. It is a silent scream of guilt, love, and remembrance, a permanent monument to a catastrophic failure that cost so many their lives. Miraculously, the Dudley brothers were eventually pardoned and released, but John's carving remains a frozen moment of his deepest despair. It is this intense, concentrated emotion, this tangible residue of human suffering etched into the very stone, that many believe makes the Beauchamp Tower a hotbed of paranormal activity. The energy here feels different from other areas of the fortress. It is not the grand tragedy of an execution, but the slow, grinding anxiety of men waiting in the dark, unsure of their fate. Visitors and staff consistently report a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that seems to cling to the small, cramped rooms. The temperature is known to plummet without warning, creating sudden, isolated cold spots that can make your breath catch in your throat. Many people speak of an overwhelming sensation of being watched, a prickling on the back of the neck that is so intense they feel compelled to turn around, only to find the room completely empty. Most chilling of all are the auditory phenomena. In the silence of the Beauchamp Tower, people have reported hearing the faint, unmistakable sound of whispering. It is never loud enough to make out distinct words, but the tone is consistently described as urgent, fearful, and mournful. It is the sound of desperate men praying, of conspirators sharing their final secrets, or of prisoners murmuring their goodbyes. These are not the echoes of a noisy crowd, but the intimate, phantom whispers of individuals, seeming to come from just behind you or from a shadowy corner of the room. The effect is profoundly unsettling, creating a feeling that you are not just learning about history, but are temporarily sharing a space with those who are still living through it. The carvings on the wall provide a focal point for this energy, a physical object that seems to act as an anchor, tethering these restless spirits to the location of their greatest anguish and allowing their whispers to bleed through the veil of time. Yet if the Beauchamp Tower holds the whispered fears of individuals, the very heart of the fortress, the White Tower, seems to pulse with a far older, more primal form of dread. This is the oldest structure in the entire complex, the Great Keep commissioned by William the Conqueror himself to dominate the skyline of London and subdue its people. Built with stone specially imported from Caen in France, its immense, thick walls were designed not just for defense, but as a brutal statement of absolute Norman power. For over 900 years, it has stood as an immutable symbol of authority, and within its cavernous, stone-ribbed interior, many visitors report feeling a suffocating weight of history that is almost physical in its intensity. This isn't the specific sorrow of a named ghost. It is an overwhelming, generalized atmosphere of ancient oppression, a feeling that you are standing in a place that has witnessed unending cycles of confinement, interrogation, and despair since the very dawn of England's story. The sheer age of the space is palpable. The air within the lower floors is perpetually cool and still, carrying the faint, damp scent of centuries-old stone and dust. Visitors often speak of a sudden, inexplicable heaviness in their chest, a sensation of being watched by the walls themselves, and an urgent desire to retreat back into the sunlight. This profound sense of unease is frequently reported in the basement chambers, particularly in the former torture area, and in St. John's Chapel on the second floor, one of the most beautifully preserved medieval chapels in all of England, yet one that seems to hold a silent, chilling solemnity beneath its graceful arches. It's as if the very stones have absorbed the anguish of all who passed through, from forgotten Saxon prisoners to renowned Tudor traitors, creating a reservoir of emotional energy that transcends any single story. While the princes are the White Tower's most famous spectral residents, they are far from alone. Apparitions of medieval men-at-arms have been glimpsed patrolling the deep-set window embrasures and shadowy corridors, their forms flickering and indistinct, as if they are still guarding a king who has been dust for centuries. These are not the detailed figures of the Yeoman Warders of today. They are shadows from a much older, more violent time, their chain mail and helmets glimpsed only for a moment before they fade back into the stone. More terrifying still are the reports of a chilling entity known only as the White Lady. This phantom has been seen on numerous occasions gliding soundlessly through the upper rooms, her form a stark, brilliant white against the dark Norman stone. She never speaks, never interacts, but her presence is said to bring an instantaneous and paralyzing wave of cold fear to those who encounter her, a primal reaction to a presence that feels fundamentally wrong and immensely ancient. Perhaps the most bizarre and unsettling haunting associated with the White Tower, however, involves a ghost from the tower's time as a royal menagerie. For over 600 years, the grounds housed a bizarre collection of exotic animals given as gifts to the monarch: lions, tigers, elephants, and even a polar bear that was allowed to fish in the Thames. The animals were kept in cramped, miserable conditions, and their fear and confusion undoubtedly left its own mark on the atmosphere. On several occasions, staff and visitors near the White Tower's main entrance have reported the sudden, overwhelming stench of a wild animal, a pungent, musky odor that appears from nowhere and vanishes just as quickly. Even more startling, some have described the feeling of a large, heavy body brushing past their legs in the empty corridor, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seems to vibrate through the stone floor. This phantom bear is a stark reminder that the tower's trauma is not limited to humans. It is a Chinese letter of suffering of all kinds, a place where the boundaries between the natural world and the supernatural seem to have been permanently eroded by centuries of captive misery. This leads to a compelling theory about the nature of hauntings, that certain locations, especially ones with such a long and intense history of human emotion, can act as psychic batteries. The White Tower, with its immense, dense stone walls, may not just be a setting for ghost stories, but the very source of them. Stone, particularly limestone, is porous. It absorbs moisture and temperature. The theory of stone tape or residual haunting suggests it might also be able to absorb and record intense emotional energy. The terror of a torture victim, the fervent prayer of a condemned prisoner, the rage of a betrayed king, or the confusion of a caged animal. During specific atmospheric conditions or to particularly sensitive individuals, these recordings might then play back, manifesting as apparitions, sounds, or overwhelming feelings of dread. The White Tower, therefore, might not be haunted by intelligent spirits so much as it is imbued with the emotional echoes of its own brutal history, a perfect storm of architecture and agony that allows the past to bleed relentlessly into the present. But long before the tragic queens and lost princes, even before the White Tower's stones had fully settled, the Tower of London was already earning its supernatural reputation with one of its very first and most powerful hauntings. The story centers on a figure of immense historical significance, Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket's relationship with King Henry II was famously complex, transforming from a deep friendship into a bitter and fatal rivalry. The king's infamous, frustrated cry of "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" was interpreted as a royal command by 4 of his knights, who rode to Canterbury Cathedral and brutally murdered the archbishop at the altar on December 29, 1170. This act of sacrilege sent shockwaves throughout all of Christendom, and it seems the echo of that violence reached the king's own fortress almost immediately. The legendary account states that shortly after this horrific murder, the enraged spirit of Thomas Becket manifested at the Tower of London with such immense, concentrated power that it caused a section of the newly built inner curtain wall to simply collapse. This was no mere ghostly apparition. It was a spectral event of biblical proportions, a physical demonstration of divine wrath aimed directly at the king who had, in spirit if not in direct order, commanded the act. The message was terrifyingly clear. No wall, no matter how thick, could contain the consequences of such a sin, and even the king's most secure stronghold was vulnerable to supernatural retribution. This very early account is arguably the foundational ghost story of the entire tower, establishing its identity not just as a place of worldly power, but as a locus for spiritual unrest and unresolved conflict. This initial manifestation suggests Becket's spirit was one of pure, righteous fury, a force of nature unleashed to punish a betrayal. Yet, over the centuries that followed, the character of his alleged presence seems to have evolved. With the tower becoming a prison for countless religious figures, Catholic priests and loyalists who, like Becket, found themselves on the wrong side of the monarch's religious decrees, a new legend emerged. Some began to believe that Becket's spirit did not merely vanish after its explosive debut, but instead remained within the fortress as a kind of spectral guardian. His ghost was no longer just an avenger, it was now a protector, a sanctified presence watching over those who shared his faith and his fate, offering a sliver of divine comfort within the cold, secular walls of their imprisonment. This protective role is powerfully illustrated in the story of another imprisoned cleric, St. John Fisher. Imprisoned in the bell tower by Henry VIII for refusing to acknowledge the king as the head of the Church of England, the elderly and frail bishop was facing a fate similar to Becket's. According to the tale, the night before his execution in 1535, Fisher was visited in his cell by a comforting, luminous apparition. Many who heard the account believed it was the spirit of Thomas Becket, offering solace and strength to a fellow man of God standing firm against the overreach of a tyrannical king. This story transforms Becket from a ghost of vengeance into a beacon of resilience, his spirit serving as a timeless symbol of spiritual defiance against temporal power. The enduring presence of Becket's legend at the tower speaks to something deeper than a simple ghost story. It connects the fortress's haunted reputation directly to one of the most pivotal moments in English history, grounding the supernatural in undeniable historical trauma. His story provides a theological and moral framework for the countless other tragedies that would unfold there. It suggests that the tower's hauntings are not random, but are part of a continuous thread of conflict between authority and conscience, between the crown and the cross. The very stones of the fortress, first shaken by his spirit, seem to have become permanently attuned to this struggle, ensuring that the echo of Thomas Becket's defiant stand would resonate through the centuries, long after the kings who opposed him were gone. While individual spirits like Anne Boleyn or the Lost Princes tell deeply personal stories of tragedy, the Tower of London also plays host to phenomena of a far grander and more unsettling scale, collective hauntings that suggest the entire fortress is reverberating with the echoes of its past. When the last tourist has departed and the great gates are locked for the night, a different kind of activity is said to begin. The silence of the ancient courtyards and cobbled lanes is routinely broken by a cacophony of unexplained sounds, an auditory tapestry of the tower's violent history seeming to replay itself. Guards on the night watch, the very individuals tasked with protecting this historic site, are often the primary witnesses to these disquieting events, reporting noises that defy all logical explanation. The most commonly reported sound is the sudden, jarring clash of steel on steel, as if two invisible combatants are dueling in a moonlit yard. This is swiftly followed by the chilling, distant echo of agonized screams that seem to rise from the very stones before being cut off abruptly into an even deeper silence. Perhaps more unnerving than these violent outbursts are the slower, more deliberate sounds. The slow, methodical drag of something heavy, what could be a body or a coffin, across the cobblestones is a frequent and deeply unsettling report. On still nights, the air has been known to carry the faint, mournful notes of a choir chanting a dirge, a spectral funeral service with no visible congregation. These are not the isolated noises of a single ghost. They feel like the background score to the tower's entire tragic history, a random and chaotic sampling of centuries of suffering that continues to leak into the present. The most awe-inspiring and terrifying of all these collective phenomena, however, are the sightings of full spectral processions. These are not fleeting glimpses of a single figure, but detailed, organized apparitions involving dozens of participants, moving with a solemn, purposeful rhythm. Witnesses describe seeing a silent parade of figures draped in ragged, dark robes, their faces often obscured by hoods or shadows, marching in a slow, unified line. They are most frequently reported moving along the path that leads from the Wakefield Tower towards the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, the very route that condemned prisoners would have walked on their way to the execution block on Tower Green. The atmosphere during these sightings is described as thick with a palpable dread and an overwhelming sense of sorrow, a feeling so powerful that it can leave witnesses frozen in place, unable to look away. The prevailing interpretation of these ghostly parades is that they represent the souls of the executed, eternally condemned to retrace their final, fatal journey. They are not marching to their deaths, but rather to their own funerals, forever processing towards the chapel where so many of them were hastily buried beneath the cold altar. This transforms the phenomenon from a simple replay of history into a perpetual cycle of penance or remembrance, a nightly ritual played out by spirits who may not even be aware of the living world around them. It is a haunting of profound pathos, suggesting that even in death, the rituals of justice and burial must continue for those who met such untimely and violent ends. These processions are not always composed of anonymous figures. On certain anniversaries, the parades are said to be led by more distinct, recognizable phantoms. There are accounts of a procession where a headless woman in an elegant gown walks with pride at the front, believed by many to be Anne Boleyn finally presiding over a court of her peers. Other reports describe two small figures in white nightshirts, their hands clasped tightly, being led along by taller, dark-robed forms, a heartbreaking vision of the princes being escorted by their unknowable captors. These specific details add a layer of profound depth to the phenomenon, connecting the anonymous, collective haunting to the individual stories of loss that give the tower its enduring emotional power. What makes these accounts so compelling is their consistency and the credibility of the sources. The reports do not only come from eager tourists suggestible to a good ghost story. They are meticulously documented in the official logbooks of the Yeoman Warders, the military guards, and even by respected historians conducting after-hours research. These are trained observers, often skeptical individuals who have spent their careers within the fortress walls, who find themselves confronted with events that challenge their understanding of reality. The collective nature of these hauntings, witnessed by multiple people simultaneously and recorded in sober, factual language, lends them a weight that solitary apparitions sometimes lack. It suggests that the energy imprinted on the tower is not merely personal or residual, but at times becomes potent enough to manifest in a way that is shared, witnessed, and utterly undeniable, turning the entire fortress into a stage for a performance that has been running for centuries. Amidst the stone and shadow of this ancient fortress, there exists a living legend, one that walks on black wings and speaks in guttural croaks. The ravens of the Tower of London are far more than mere residents. They are officially known as the guardians of the tower, protected by a royal decree that dates back centuries. The origins of this belief are shrouded in time, but the prophecy is crystal clear. Should the ravens ever permanently leave the tower, the White Tower will crumble and a great calamity will befall the kingdom. This is not a quaint superstition but a deeply held tradition, taken so seriously that the bird's wings are carefully clipped to ensure they cannot stray too far, a necessary measure to safeguard the nation's very fate. The yeoman warder dedicated to their care, known as the Raven Master, is entrusted with one of the most unique and solemn duties in all of England, tending to these feathered custodians of Britain's destiny. Yet, what if their role extends beyond symbolic prophecy? Corvids, the family of birds that includes ravens and crows, are renowned for their exceptional intelligence, problem-solving skills, and complex social behaviors. They are among the few animal species known to use tools, recognize individual human faces, and even hold what appear to be funerals for their dead. Their sharp, observant eyes seem to miss nothing in their environment, leading many to speculate that these brilliant birds are not just living at a haunted site. They might be acutely aware of the paranormal activity that permeates it. The possibility exists that the ravens are sensitive to the same energy fluctuations and phenomena that human visitors report, perceiving a world just beyond our own limited senses. The Raven Masters, who spend their days in close quarters with these enigmatic birds, have accumulated a wealth of peculiar anecdotes that seem to support this theory. They often report instances where the ravens will suddenly cease their playful antics or foraging, becoming utterly still and focused on a point in empty space. Their heads will tilt, their intelligent eyes will track something moving across a courtyard, and they will issue a low, soft cruck-cruck sound, a call distinctly different from their usual loud cries of alarm or communication. It is the behavior of a creature intently observing something it finds interesting or puzzling, a response typically reserved for spotting a small animal or a novel object, except there is never anything visible there for them to see. There are specific locations within the tower grounds where the birds are noted to gather without any apparent earthly reason. They have been observed congregating on the railing near the site of the execution block on Tower Green, sitting in an unnervingly silent and orderly row as if attending a spectral event. On other occasions, a single bird will be seen perched on a windowsill of the Salt Tower, softly gurgling and clicking at the ancient stone, behaviors that mimic the way they interact with the Raven Master when he speaks to them. Perhaps most chillingly, there are accounts from night guards of hearing the ravens, safely secured in their enclosures, becoming suddenly and collectively agitated long after dark, their wings flapping and their calls echoing through the silent fortress only for the disturbance to cease as abruptly as it began, leaving behind an eerie silence that feels heavier than before. This apparent sensitivity makes a strange kind of sense when you consider the nature of the place they call home. For nearly a millennium, the tower has been a vortex of heightened human emotion, extremes of terror, despair, betrayal, and sudden, violent death. If the theory of residual energy or stone tape is valid, then the very atmosphere of the fortress could be electrically charged with these imprints. The ravens, with their keen perceptual abilities, might be tuning into these frequencies, reacting to echoes of the past that remain entirely invisible and inaudible to human visitors. Their strange behaviors could be them interacting with the permanent residents we can only glimpse as ghosts. This unique connection blurs the line between the superstition of the old prophecy and a more modern, intriguing paranormal possibility. The legend says the ravens protect the kingdom from physical collapse, but perhaps their true guardianship is even more profound. Maybe their presence acts as an anchor, a stabilizing force within a location saturated with spiritual unrest. Or perhaps in their own unknowable way, they are the diligent witnesses, the eternal custodians not just of the crown's legacy, but of every soul that has ever passed through the traitor's gate. They are the living, breathing link between our world and the shadowy history that clings to the tower's stones, their dark feathers and sharper eyes holding secrets we can only begin to imagine. While the ancient stones hold their secrets, they are not the only witnesses to the enduring mysteries of the Tower of London. The most compelling and credible accounts do not come from fleeting visitors, but from the very individuals who call this fortress home, the Yeoman Warders, more famously known as the Beefeaters. Their role is far more profound than their iconic Tudor-style uniforms might suggest. They are ceremonial guardians, tour guides, and most intriguingly, permanent residents who live within the tower's walls with their own families. This unparalleled access, spending their days and nights immersed in the atmosphere of the place, grants them a perspective that is both unique and deeply authoritative. They are not just telling stories passed down through generations. They are sharing chapters from their own lives, experiences that have unfolded in their own hallways and outside their own front doors. Imagine tucking your children into bed at night, knowing that outside your window lies a courtyard where history's most famous executions took place. For the warders and their families, this is simply daily life. Their long-term residency means they become intimately familiar with every normal creak and groan of the ancient buildings, every sound made by the ravens, and every shadow cast by the moon. This familiarity is what makes their testimonies so powerful. They possess a finely tuned sense for when something is out of place. Their accounts are not the excited reports of a tourist on a ghost tour. They are the sober, often reluctant, admissions of military-trained professionals who have encountered phenomena they simply cannot explain through any rational means. One of the most common and most chilling experiences shared by multiple warders involves the sound of children. In a place where two young princes met their end, the sound of a child's laughter echoing down a deserted stone corridor in the dead of night is enough to freeze the blood. Several warders have reported this very phenomenon, only to investigate and find the areas utterly empty and silent. More disturbing still are the accounts of hearing faint, desperate weeping, the sound of a child in clear distress that seems to emanate from within the walls of the bloody tower, only to fade away the moment one gets too close. These oral hauntings are particularly affecting because they speak to a loss of innocence, a presence that feels forever trapped in a moment of fear. Then there are the visual apparitions, encounters that leave even the most seasoned veterans shaken. There are numerous reports of figures seen in full period dress, their attire unmistakably from another century, behaving in ways that defy logic. A warder on his nightly patrol might see a woman in an elaborate Tudor gown turn a corner ahead of him. Assuming a costumed interpreter has stayed late, he quickens his pace to check on her, only to find the corridor beyond completely vacant, with no doors or passages she could have used to escape. Others have described seeing the distinct form of a tall man in Elizabethan clothing, believed by many to be Sir Walter Raleigh, pacing the battlements before simply dissolving into the mist. These are not fleeting glimpses in the periphery of vision. They are full-bodied, detailed apparitions that appear solid and real until they aren't. Perhaps the most terrifying category of encounter involves direct, intelligent interaction. There is a well-documented story of a yeoman warder who, while locking up the Queen's house for the night, came face to face with a pale woman in a dark, old-fashioned dress standing at the top of a staircase. He initially admonished her, thinking she was a lost tourist, but as he began to climb the stairs toward her, she fixed him with a gaze of profound sadness and then stepped backward directly through the solid, locked door behind her. The warder, a man not given to flights of fancy, was left utterly stunned, his keys trembling in his hand. Another account tells of a warder's wife who was alone in their lodgings when she distinctly heard the heavy, rhythmic tread of a guardsman's boots coming down her hallway. Assuming it was her husband returning home, she called out his name. The footsteps stopped right outside her door, but no one entered. When she opened the door to investigate, the hallway was empty, the silence absolute. What makes these stories so impactful is the sheer credibility of the sources. These are former senior non-commissioned officers from the British Armed Forces, individuals with distinguished careers who are selected for this role based on impeccable service and unshakable character. They are, by nature and training, pragmatic, disciplined, and deeply skeptical of anything that cannot be proven. They do not seek out these experiences. More often than not, they are deeply unsettled by them. Their reports are recorded in official logbooks, treated not as campfire tales but as unexplained occurrences that are part of the tower's ongoing historical record. This lends their accounts a weight that transcends typical ghost lore, offering a compelling argument that the activity within the tower is not merely a product of imagination, but a persistent, observable phenomenon witnessed by some of the most reliable eyes and ears on the grounds. This unsettling experience of a sudden, bone-deep chill is one of the most frequently reported paranormal phenomena at the Tower of London, a sensation that goes far beyond a simple draft from an old window. Visitors and staff alike describe these cold spots as intensely localized pockets of air that feel unnaturally frigid, a deep and penetrating cold that seems to sap the warmth from your body and the air from your lungs in an instant. These are not gradual temperature changes you might expect in an ancient stone building. They are abrupt, jarring, and feel profoundly separate from the surrounding environment. You could be standing in a comfortably warm room in the Beauchamp Tower and take a single step forward only to be hit by a wall of cold so severe it raises goosebumps on your skin. then take a step back and return immediately to the ambient temperature. This bizarrely specific localization is what convinces many that they are not just feeling the old stones holding the night's chill, but something far more mysterious and intentional. The physiological experience is often accompanied by an equally powerful psychological response, a wave of raw emotion that seems to travel with the cold itself. The most common description is a sudden, overwhelming feeling of dread, a primal sense that something is terribly wrong. This isn't the rational fear of being in a dark, old place. It's an invasive and inexplicable anxiety that appears from nowhere, a deep-seated panic that can make your heart pound and compel you to immediately leave the area. Others report a crushing weight of sadness or despair, a melancholy so profound it can bring tears to your eyes for no discernible reason. It's as if the cold is not just a physical phenomenon, but a carrier for the emotional residue of a past trauma, forcing you to feel a fraction of the terror or sorrow that once saturated that very spot. Two of the most notorious locations for these experiences are the Salt Tower and the Beauchamp Tower, each with its own grim history that seems to feed the phenomenon. The Salt Tower was used to hold prisoners accused of religious crimes during the Tudor period, and its walls are covered in deeply etched graffiti left by these desperate men. One famous carving is a complex astrological sphere created by a Welshman named Hugh ap Evans, imprisoned in the 1500s for practicing witchcraft. The cold spots reported here are often described as particularly aggressive, carrying a sense of frantic intellectual energy and fear, as if the prisoner's desperate attempt to chart the stars and control his fate left a permanent, chilling mark. In the Beauchamp Tower, the home of the poignant Dudley grapevine carving, the cold is frequently paired with those eerie auditory whispers, creating a multi-sensory assault of cold, sound, and emotion that can be utterly paralyzing. The prevailing paranormal theory behind these cold spots is that a spiritual presence, in order to manifest or simply to sustain itself, draws energy directly from its immediate environment, specifically thermal energy. The concept suggests that a ghost might be acting like a psychic battery in reverse, pulling heat from the air to power its appearance, thereby creating a pocket of intense cold as a direct byproduct of its manifestation. This would explain why these cold spots feel so unnatural and localized. The drop in temperature isn't meteorological but paranormal, a tangible sign that an invisible presence is actively drawing energy from the world around it. The accompanying emotions could then be understood as a kind of psychic bleed-through, the raw feeling associated with the spirit imprinted on the energy it's consuming, creating a package deal of physical sensation and emotional distress that is uniquely terrifying. In the heavy, history-soaked air of the tower, it seems the very temperature can tell a story of sorrow that words cannot. But of all the locations within the fortress, perhaps none concentrates this energy more powerfully than the unassuming patch of grass known as the Scaffold site on Tower Green. This was not the public spectacle of Tower Hill, where common criminals met their end before a roaring crowd. This was a private, solemn stage reserved for the highest-ranking prisoners, a place where the crown executed its own in a grim ritual of power and purification. It was here that Anne Boleyn, Lady Jane Grey, and Margaret Pole walked their final steps, their deaths witnessed only by a select few invited guests, their last words heard by a handful of officials. The privacy of the act somehow makes it more intimate and arguably more chilling than any public spectacle could ever be. This small, enclosed green, surrounded by buildings and overlooked by windows, became ground zero for some of the most profound personal tragedies in English history. The energy reported there today is palpable and consistently intense. Visitors who approach the simple glass memorial that now marks the spot frequently describe an immediate and visceral shift in the atmosphere. The air itself feels heavier, thicker, as if saturated with a profound, silent solemnity. Many people report a sudden physical reaction, a wave of nausea, a lightheaded dizziness, or an inexplicable tightness in their chest that makes it difficult to draw a full breath. For others, the response is purely emotional, an overwhelming surge of sadness, a pricking of tears behind the eyes for lives and stories they only just learned about. It is a reaction that feels primal, bypassing the intellect and speaking directly to the soul, a somatic response to an event of such concentrated emotional violence that its echo has never faded. This is not the generalized spookiness of an old castle. It is a specific, targeted sensation that seems to emanate from the very earth. Those who are sensitive to such things often describe the scaffold site as a place where the barrier between the past and the present feels dangerously thin, almost porous. It is as if the immense weight of the emotions released in that space, the terror, the resignation, the injustice, and the final, shocking pain acted like a psychic spike, driving a permanent wound through time itself. The events are over, but the emotional shockwaves continue to ripple outward, lapping against the present and affecting those who stand in that hallowed and haunted ground. The experiences here are rarely visual apparitions of full-bodied ghosts. Instead, they are far more subtle and sensory. Some visitors have reported catching the faint, coppery scent of blood on the air, a metallic tang that appears for just a moment before vanishing. Others have felt a sudden, localized drop in temperature, a cold spot so intense it raises goosebumps on the skin, centered directly over the memorial. The most common report, however, is auditory, not the clear sound of voices, but the faint, impressionistic echoes of a moment frozen in time. The rustle of a heavy silk gown against the grass, the choked gasp of a crowd holding its breath, or the dull, final thud of an heavy object meeting wood. These are not sounds heard with the ear so much as they are impressions felt in the mind, a haunting that plays out on the stage of one's own consciousness, triggered by standing at the epicenter of the trauma. This profound connection makes the scaffold site less a tourist attraction and more a spontaneous memorial, a place where the human impulse to bear witness to suffering transcends centuries. People often fall silent there without being prompted, their chatter dying away as they are enveloped by the gravity of the location. Some feel compelled to leave flowers or small tokens, not because there is a grave to mark, but because the emotional need to acknowledge what happened is so powerful. It is a testament to the idea that certain acts of violence are so profound that they can stain a location forever, imbuing it with a sacred, sorrowful energy that calls out to the living, demanding that we remember and that we feel long after the history books have been closed. But if the scaffold site is where these lives ended, there is one place within the tower walls that serves as their final, collective resting place, a location where the weight of history feels most sacred and most sorrowful, the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula. The name itself, meaning St. Peter in chains, is profoundly fitting, for this small, unassuming chapel stands as a symbol of both spiritual solace and earthly imprisonment, a place where the bonds of life were finally broken. Originally built to serve the spiritual needs of the tower's community, it gradually took on a far grimmer role, becoming the designated burial ground for those of high rank executed on Tower Green. Unlike the public criminals executed on Tower Hill, who are often tossed into unmarked pits, these privileged few were granted the dignity of a Christian burial, however hasty and secretive it may have been within the hallowed ground of the chapel. Beneath the simple stone floor, under the very pews where visitors now sit, lies a who's who of Tudor tragedy. The bodies of Anne Boleyn and her cousin, Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's second and fifth wives, lie here alongside the noble Sir Thomas More and the formidable Queen Jane Grey. They were buried hastily and without marker, their graves lost for centuries until a meticulous excavation in the 1800s finally identified their remains and placed a memorial tile on the floor to mark the approximate location of each. To stand in the chapel today is to stand directly atop one of the most concentrated sites of historical sorrow in all of England. It is not a museum exhibit, it is an active tomb, and the atmosphere is heavy with a palpable, reverent silence that feels vastly different from the eerie chill of the towers. The paranormal activity reported within the chapel is rarely aggressive or frightening. Instead, it is deeply solemn and strangely communal. Visitors and staff consistently report the uncanny sensation of not being alone, even when the chapel is completely empty. It is not the feeling of being watched by a single presence, but the overwhelming impression of being in a crowded room, a silent congregation of the unseen. The air itself feels thick, almost pressurized, with a profound sense of anticipation or memory. People describe hearing the faint, almost subliminal sound of breathing, the soft rustle of fabric from the empty pews behind them, or the subtle shift of weight as if someone has just sat down beside them, only to turn and find the space vacant. The most awe-inspiring reports, however, involve full sensory manifestations that transform the empty chapel into a scene from the past. On certain evenings, particularly around the anniversaries of the executions, the entire space seems to come alive with spectral energy. Witnesses have described the sudden appearance of faint, shimmering figures occupying every pew, a ghostly congregation dressed in the fashions of the Tudor court, sitting in perfect, silent attendance. The air grows cold and still, charged with emotion that is often described as a mixture of deep grief and unwavering dignity. Then the sound begins not through the ears, but felt in the very bones of a choir singing a hymn in perfect harmonic Latin. The music is beautiful, ethereal, and utterly heartbreaking, a phantom requiem mass for the souls buried below. This haunting is not one of restless individuals, but of a collective memory, a ritual forever frozen in time. The apparitions do not interact with the living. They seem entirely focused on their own eternal service, forever mourning their own passing or perhaps bearing witness to the others who share their fate. The energy is one of profound peace, but a peace steeped in an inescapable tragedy. It suggests that these spirits are not lost or trapped in agony, but have instead gathered together in the one place that offered them final sanctuary, their presence a permanent tribute to the lives they led and the brutal ways they ended. To experience it is to understand that the Chapel Royal is not just a building. It is a living, breathing monument to remembrance, where the line between the past and the present dissolves into a shared, silent prayer. And if the story of Margaret Pole showcases the horror of a botched execution, the tale of Catherine Howard reveals the raw, unvarnished terror that precedes it. She was Henry VIII's fifth wife, a young woman barely out of her teens when she caught the aging king's eye with her vibrancy and charm. He called her his rose without a thorn, a perfect jewel to revive his spirits. But that youthful exuberance which had so captivated him would soon be twisted into evidence of her downfall. Catherine's past and a handful of indiscreet flirtations after her marriage were uncovered by the king's ministers and presented to him as proof of rampant adultery and treason. For a king obsessed with his legacy and increasingly paranoid about betrayal, this was the ultimate insult. At just 19 years old, Catherine found herself imprisoned in the Tower of London, her fate sealed long before her sham of a trial even began. Her final days were a masterclass in psychological torture. She was held in the same rooms that her cousin, Anne Boleyn, had occupied just 6 years earlier before her own execution, a grim coincidence that could not have been lost on the terrified young queen. Confined and isolated, she must have been able to hear the carpenters building the very scaffold upon which she would die, the hammer blows echoing through the stone corridors as a relentless countdown to her own death. It was in this atmosphere of absolute dread that the legendary event occurred, the moment that would etch her spirit permanently into the fabric of the Queen's house. According to the enduring tale, in a final, desperate burst of primal survival instinct, Catherine somehow escaped her guards. She broke free from her rooms and ran, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror, down the hallway. Her goal was not escape from the tower itself, an impossible feat, but something far more poignant. She was seen sprinting toward the door to the Chapel Royal, where the king was known to sometimes worship. She was not running from her fate, but toward the only person she believed could still stop it, her husband. Witnesses described her screaming, her voice ragged with panic, as she pounded her fists against the heavy wooden door, begging for Henry's mercy, pleading for him to see her, to remember his love for her, to call off the machinery of death he had set in motion. Her cries were not those of a queen, but of a terrified child, utterly alone and facing the abyss. The guards, of course, quickly apprehended her, dragging her, still screaming and struggling, back to her prison. That final, failed bid for life would be her last truly autonomous act. It is this specific, heart-stopping moment of pure, unadulterated despair that her ghost is condemned to relive. The haunting of Catherine Howard is not one of quiet sorrow or dignified procession. It is a violent, auditory explosion of panic that shatters the silence. The apparition is most often reported as a blur of motion, a young woman in a dark Tudor-era gown seen fleetingly as she races down the hallway in the Queen's house. But it is the sound that truly defines this haunting and makes it one of the most frightening in the entire tower. Witnesses, including numerous Yeoman Warders and their families who live on site, have reported being jolted by the sudden, blood-curdling sound of a woman's screams. They are not gentle whispers or muffled cries. They are described as full-throated, gut-wrenching shrieks of absolute terror, the kind that can only come from someone who knows they are about to die. The screams are often accompanied by another, more physical phantom sound, the frantic, pounding fists against the old door to the chapel, a desperate drumbeat of a life pleading for itself. These sounds seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, filling the corridor with their anguish before cutting off abruptly, leaving behind a silence that feels even deeper and more unsettling than before. The emotional residue left in the wake of this spectral reenactment is palpable. Those who have heard it describe a lingering atmosphere of intense panic and profound sadness, a feeling that the very air itself is vibrating with the echo of a trauma that happened nearly 500 years ago. What makes Catherine's ghost so uniquely devastating is her youth. She was not a seasoned political player like Anne Boleyn. She was a teenage girl who was utterly out of her depth, used by the powerful men around her, and then discarded by the most powerful man in the kingdom when she became inconvenient. Her haunting feels like the manifestation of that stolen youth and innocence, forever frozen in its most terrified, vulnerable moment. Her spirit does not walk with purpose or linger with sorrow. It runs and it screams. It is a raw nerve of a ghost, a perpetual reminder that within these stone walls, behind the grand titles and historical dates, were real people who experienced real, overwhelming fear. The echo of Catherine Howard's final, desperate run ensures that we never forget the human cost of Henry's wrath, a cost paid in the currency of a young woman's terror. Yet if the ancient stones of the White Tower and the sorrow-soaked ground of Tower Green speak of centuries past, one of the tower's most famous attractions holds a haunting of a much more recent and audacious vintage. The Jewel House, home to the priceless crown jewels, is a fortress within a fortress, a state-of-the-art stronghold of concrete, steel, and bulletproof glass designed to thwart the most determined modern thief. Yet, for all its technological might, it may be host to a presence that simply cannot be deterred by alarms or physical barriers, the restless spirit of the only man who ever came close to pulling off the greatest heist in British history. His name was Colonel Thomas Blood, and his plot was as brazen as it was brilliant. In 1671, disguised as a parson, Blood managed to befriend the elderly keeper of the jewels, Talbot Edwards, even proposing a marriage between a fictional nephew and Edward's own daughter. This ruse granted him the trust and access he needed. On the 9th of May, he arrived with his nephew and 2 other accomplices. The moment they were alone with the jewels, they pounced. They overpowered the old man, bludgeoning him with a mallet and stabbing him before using the same tool to flatten the crown of St. Edward so it could be hidden under a cloak. They stuffed the sovereign's orb into a pocket and were in the process of sawing the scepter with the cross in half when they were unexpectedly discovered by Edward's son, who had returned home early. What followed was a chaotic chase. Blood and his men fought their way out, firing pistols at the pursuing guards as they fled toward the Iron Gate. Blood himself was captured just as he was about to escape onto the busy Thames, the stolen crown tumbling from his cloak. In a stunning turn of events, King Charles II, rather than having the audacious thief executed, was so impressed by his sheer boldness that he pardoned him and even granted him land in Ireland. Blood became a celebrity, a folk hero who had outwitted the system and lived to tell the tale, his failure somehow more famous than any success could ever have been. But while his body lived out its days in freedom, many believe a part of Colonel Blood's obsessive spirit never truly left the scene of his greatest ambition. The modern-day Jewel House, for all its impervious security, is a hotbed of unexplained activity that seems to follow a very specific pattern. Security guards, the highly trained professionals tasked with protecting the regalia, are the primary witnesses to these strange events. They report phantom alarms where the sophisticated sensors are triggered without any discernible cause, sending teams into a frantic scramble to identify an intruder who simply isn't there. Review of the footage shows nothing, no physical breach, no malfunction, just empty rooms and silent cases. More chilling are the visual anomalies caught on camera and witnessed in person. Guards monitoring the live feeds have described seeing shadows detaching themselves from the corners of the room, moving with a purpose and intelligence that a trick of the light could not explain. These are not vague, shifting forms. They are described as a distinct man-shaped darkness that glides between the jewel cases, pausing as if to study the very treasures it once tried to steal. Those walking the patrol route after hours often report the unmistakable sensation of not being alone, of a palpable, intelligent presence observing them from just out of sight. It is not a feeling of generalized dread, but of being specifically and intently watched by an unseen companion. The activity often centers on the very regalia Blood targeted. Guards have reported hearing the faint, metallic scrape of a blade against glass near the case holding the crown of St. Edward, the crown he so famously crushed. Others have felt a sudden, localized drop in temperature right before one of the unexplained alarms is triggered, as if a concentrated burst of energy is drawn from the air to power a momentary manifestation. This is not the residual haunt of a tragic figure reliving their death. It is the persistent, intelligent presence of a man defined by his cunning, his ambition, and his fascination with these ultimate symbols of power. Colonel Blood's ghost isn't trapped by trauma. It is seemingly held by obsession, forever drawn back to the glittering prizes that so nearly became his, a master thief still attempting the job from beyond the grave. While the lost princes are the most famous child spirits said to dwell within the fortress, they are far from the only young souls whose laughter and tears seem to echo through time. The tower's history is not solely one of traitors and kings. It was also, for centuries, a functioning community where people lived, worked, and raised families within its protective yet oppressive walls. It is this domestic history that seems to have given rise to a different kind of haunting, one not of political tragedy, but of everyday life and loss, forever immortalized in the playful and sometimes sorrowful phantoms of children. One of the most frequently reported apparitions is that of a young boy, distinct from the prince's, seen on the battlements near the Salt Tower. Witnesses describe a small figure dressed in a simple white nightgown, his form often shimmering with a faint, ethereal light against the dark stone. He is not crying or fleeing, but is most often seen playing a solitary game, running along the wall walk as if chasing an invisible companion or peering curiously through the arrow loops at the modern city sprawling beyond. His presence is less one of sorrow and more one of innocent curiosity, a spirit seemingly unaware of his own tragic circumstance, forever captivated by the grand views from the fortress walls. In the courtyards below, particularly near the former site of the medieval royal apartments known as the Great Hall, another young phantom makes her presence known. This is the spectral image of a little girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, dressed in the simple smock of a commoner from a bygone era. She is most often described on clear, moonlit nights, seen skipping across the cobblestones, her feet making no sound as she moves through patches of mist. Some accounts mention her humming a tuneless, forgotten song, a sound that seems to carry on the still night air before fading away as suddenly as it began. Her apparition feels like a glimpse into a moment of pure, childish joy, a fleeting pocket of normalcy preserved within a place so often associated with fear. Yet for every report of playful phantoms, there are an equal number of chilling auditory experiences that suggest a deeper undercurrent of pain. In the residential areas where the Yeoman Warders and their families have lived for generations, the sound of children is a common feature of daily life. But when those familiar sounds occur in the dead of night, emanating from empty hallways and sealed rooms, they take on an entirely different character. Parents have reported being woken by the distinct, desperate sound of a child sobbing, a heart-wrenching cry that seems to come from just outside their door or from within the very walls of their ancient lodgings. Investigations invariably reveal nothing, the haunting sound ceasing the moment a light is switched on or a door is opened. Equally unsettling are the bursts of faint, echoing laughter that occasionally ring through deserted areas like the medieval palace or the lower floors of the Wakefield Tower. This is not the joyful noise of a living playground, but a disembodied echo, a recording of mirth that seems to play back on a loop disconnected from any visible source. The effect is profoundly uncanny, a sound that should signify life and happiness instead creating a deep sense of loneliness and unease, as if the listener is overhearing a moment from a world they can never join. These experiences point toward the often overlooked reality of life and death for children within the tower's history. While we remember the princes, countless other children were born, lived, and died within these walls. The offspring of kings, like the children of Henry III and Edward I, spent their formative years in the royal apartments, their lives a blend of immense privilege and gilded confinement. More commonly, it was the children of the garrison soldiers, servants, and later the warders who called the tower home. In the harsh conditions of the medieval and early modern periods, childhood mortality was tragically high. Diseases like the plague, smallpox, and typhoid would have swept through the crowded fortress, claiming young lives with brutal efficiency. A minor fall on the unforgiving stone steps, an accident in the kitchen yards, or a winter chill could easily prove fatal. It is this collective history of innocence lost that many believe fuels these haunting manifestations. The energy of a child is uniquely potent, unfiltered, intense, and pure. Their joys are explosive, their fears are absolute, and their sorrows are all-consuming. When a life is cut short at such a young age within an environment as emotionally charged as the tower, that powerful emotional signature may imprint itself on the location with particular strength. The playful apparitions could be residual echoes, moments of pure happiness somehow recorded and replayed by the ancient stones. The cries and sobs, however, may signal something more, the presence of spirits who are genuinely confused, frightened, and unaware of their transition, forever seeking the comfort of parents who have been dust for centuries. These lost children of the tower remind us that its story is woven not just from threads of ambition and power, but from the quieter, more universal human experiences of family, innocence, and the heartbreak of a life ended far too soon. But among the human tragedies that saturate the tower's history, there exists a haunting of a completely different nature, one that adds a unique and deeply unsettling layer to its supernatural tapestry. For over 600 years, the Tower of London was home to the Royal Menagerie, a bizarre and often cruel collection of exotic animals gifted to the monarch by rulers from across the globe. The first recorded arrival was in 1235, when the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II sent 3 leopards to Henry III as a symbol of his royal power. This was just the beginning. Over the centuries, the grounds housed lions, tigers, a troop of crocodiles, an African elephant, and even a polar bear that was allowed to swim and fish in the Thames while secured by a long chain. These magnificent creatures were not kept in anything resembling humane conditions. They were symbols of status and dominance, confined to small, damp, iron-barred cages in what was known as the Lion Tower, their roars and bellows of confusion and misery becoming a constant, unsettling soundtrack to life within the fortress. This long period of captive suffering seems to have left its own distinct psychic imprint on the tower, manifesting in sightings and sensations that are utterly alien compared to the apparitions of Tudor courtiers or lost princes. The most famous of these animal phantoms is undoubtedly the ghostly bear, most often reported in and around the Brick Tower. The legend is often linked to a specific incident in the 13th century, a tragic tale where a female polar bear, agitated and distressed, allegedly broke free from its keeper and mauled a child to death before being slain by guards. Whether this specific story is true or a later invention to explain the phenomena, the apparition itself has been witnessed by numerous credible sources. Visitors and staff have described the sudden, overwhelming stench of a wild animal, a pungent, musky odor that appears from nowhere, completely out of place in the ancient stone corridors. Even more startling are the physical sensations. People have reported feeling the brush of a large, heavy body against their legs in an empty passageway, a presence so tangible they instinctively jump aside. Some have even heard the low, guttural growl that seems to vibrate up through the stone floor, a sound that evokes a primal fear entirely separate from any human ghost. Beyond the bear, the auditory echoes of the menagerie also persist. On still, foggy nights, guards on patrol have reported hearing sounds that defy all logic. The distant, echoing roar of a big cat, a sound that hasn't legitimately echoed from the tower's walls since the menagerie was finally closed and moved to the London Zoo in 1835. These roars are not the gentle sounds of a zoo in the distance. They are described as close, aggressive, and full of pent-up fury, seeming to emanate from the very foundations of the buildings that once housed them. Others have reported the frantic, chattering screech of monkeys or the unsettling, heavy tread of something large and ponderous moving in a space far too small for it. These are not the intelligent remnants of human spirits. They feel like residual energy, emotional recordings of fear, frustration, and raw instinct trapped in a perpetual loop, replaying the daily trauma of their long and unnatural confinement. The existence of these animal hauntings adds a profound and unexpected dimension to the tower's supernatural profile. It suggests that the fortress does not just record human emotion and drama, but that it can absorb the raw, primal energy of any being that suffers intensely within its walls. The terror of a trapped animal is a pure, instinctual thing, and that purity of emotion may create an imprint that is uniquely potent and persistent. These spectral remnants of the royal menagerie serve as a somber reminder that the tower's history of captivity and cruelty was not limited to people. It was a place where the wild and exotic were stripped of their freedom and put on display, their spirits seemingly as trapped within the stone as those of the princes in the Bloody Tower or the queens on the Green, ensuring that even the most innocent and unwilling residents of this ancient fortress are never truly forgotten. But the experience of a haunting is no longer confined to those who walk the grounds. In our modern age, it is often captured through the lens of a camera, providing tantalizing and hotly debated pieces of evidence for skeptics and believers alike. Visitors to the Tower of London, armed with smartphones and digital cameras, have returned home with thousands of photographs that contain strange and unexplained anomalies, visual glitches that many insist are glimpses into the fortress's spectral population. These images fall into several distinct categories, each with its own compelling arguments for and against a supernatural origin, adding a complex digital layer to the ancient lore. The most common anomaly by far is the appearance of orbs, These are typically small, circular balls of light that appear to float in the air, often translucent or with a swirling, misty interior. They show up in photographs where the photographer saw nothing with the naked eye, drifting in corridors, hovering near the ancient graffiti in the Beauchamp Tower, or clustering near the scaffold site on Tower Green. Paranormal enthusiasts point to their seemingly intelligent movement and their tendency to appear in areas with high levels of reported activity as proof they are spiritual energy, perhaps the very essence of a soul manifesting in its simplest form. They argue that the timing and placement are too specific to be mere coincidence, often appearing in frames taken seconds before or after a completely normal shot. Skeptics, however, offer a far more mundane yet scientifically sound explanation. They attribute the vast majority of orb phenomena to backscatter. This occurs when the camera's flash or a strong light source illuminates tiny particles very close to the lens, such as dust, pollen, or moisture droplets like rain or fog. These particles are often invisible to the human eye because they are out of focus, but the camera captures them as ethereal, glowing spheres. The tower, with its ancient, often dusty stonework and its location by the frequently misty River Thames, provides the perfect environmental conditions for this photographic effect. The debate rages on, with one side seeing profound meaning in a floating speck and the other seeing simple physics at work. Far more compelling than simple orbs are the photographs that capture unexplained mists or vaporous forms. These anomalies are larger and more structured, often appearing as thick, rolling banks of fog or swirling, ectoplasmic clouds that seem to possess a vague shape and intention. Unlike orbs, these mists are frequently reported as being seen with the naked eye at the time the photo was taken, only to have vanished a moment later. One famous example, taken near the Bloody Tower, shows a dense, white mist that seems to be coalescing into a humanoid form, obscuring part of a modern informational sign behind it. The photographer swore the corridor was clear when they pressed the shutter, and the mist's defined edges and opacity make the backscatter argument less convincing. Skeptics counter that these mists can also be created by environmental factors. Breath on a cold day, especially in the dank, unheated lower chambers of the White Tower, can appear as a thick plume of vapor when caught by a camera flash. Similarly, a person smoking an electronic cigarette or a patch of ground fog drifting in from the river could be captured in a single frame and misinterpreted. Yet, for every skeptical explanation, there exists a photograph where the context seems to rule it out. A mist appearing on a warm, dry day inside a sealed room, or a form that seems to mirror the cut of a historical garment hanging in the air with an unsettling specificity. The holy grail of paranormal photography, however, is the full-bodied apparition captured amidst a crowd of modern tourists. These are the images that truly capture the imagination, showing figures dressed in period clothing, a Tudor gown, a medieval tunic, the dark robes of a monk standing silently among people in jeans and t-shirts. The most convincing examples show a figure that is partially transparent, with background objects visible through their body, or who appears sharply in focus while the living people around them are slightly blurred by motion. One particularly chilling photograph, taken in a corridor of the medieval palace, appears to show a woman in a dark, hooded dress turning away from the camera, her form solid and detailed, yet completely ignored by the family walking just feet away from her. For skeptics, these images are the easiest to debunk, yet also the most frustrating for believers. They are often attributed to living history interpreters or costumed guides who have momentarily stepped out of view, their period attire perfectly authentic. A trick of the light, a double exposure in older film cameras, or even deliberate digital manipulation can all create a convincing phantom. The burden of proof, they argue, lies with the photographer to provide unedited original files and to account for every person in the vicinity at the time. Yet, there remain a handful of enigmatic photographs that survive rigorous scrutiny, images where every living person is accounted for, where the lighting conditions cannot explain the figure, and where the expression and posture of the apparition seem to belong to another time entirely. These contested images form a modern chapter in the tower's enduring mystery, a digital age debate that ensures the conversation between the past and the present is more alive and more controversial than ever before. With so many compelling stories and first-hand accounts, it's natural to wonder what lies at the heart of these phenomena. Could there be a scientific explanation for the chills, the whispers, and the apparitions? In recent decades, the Tower of London has become a magnet for paranormal investigation groups, all hoping to capture concrete evidence of the supernatural. These teams arrive armed with an array of sophisticated technology, from electromagnetic field meters designed to detect unexplained energy fluctuations to electronic voice phenomena recorders that aim to capture the whispers of the disembodied. Thermal imaging cameras scan the ancient stones for cold spots, while motion sensors are set up to detect movement in sealed rooms. The results of these investigations, however, are a fascinating mix of the intriguing and the inconclusive. There are recordings that purport to capture faint, pleading voices in the Beauchamp Tower when no one was present, and EMF meters have spiked in locations with no apparent electrical source, often coinciding with a witness's feeling of being watched. Yet, for every anomalous reading, there are countless hours of silence and empty data, leaving the ultimate question of proof still very much open to debate. This lack of definitive scientific evidence is the cornerstone of the skeptical viewpoint, which offers a range of alternative explanations rooted in psychology and environmental science. One of the most powerful factors at play is suggestibility. When you step into a place like the Tower of London, you are immediately immersed in a narrative. You know the stories of Anne Boleyn, the Lost Princes, and the countless executions before you even see the first stone. This powerful preconception primes your brain to interpret ambiguous stimuli through a supernatural lens. A sudden draft from a centuries-old ventilation shaft becomes a ghostly chill. The muffled echo of a tourist group in another room transforms into distant weeping. The natural creaking of ancient timber settling in the night is heard as the footstep of an unseen presence. Your mind, influenced by the overwhelming weight of history, expertly connects the dots, often creating a paranormal experience from a series of mundane events. Beyond psychology, there are also compelling physical phenomena that can mimic the classic signs of a haunting. One particularly interesting theory involves infrasound, which is sound at a frequency too low for the human ear to hear, below 20 Hz. Though we cannot consciously hear it, our bodies can still sense these low-frequency waves, which can be generated by strong winds passing through old corridors, distant underground trains, or even the powerful vibrations of the tower's own generators. Studies have shown that exposure to infrasound can induce feelings of intense unease, profound sadness, and even the unsettling sensation of being watched. It can cause your eyeballs to vibrate slightly, potentially creating the illusion of movement in your peripheral vision, the classic glimpse of a shadowy figure. When you combine this physiological effect with the power of suggestion inherent in the tower's atmosphere, the stage is perfectly set for a supernatural experience that feels entirely real, yet has a perfectly natural, if unusual, cause. Furthermore, we must consider the building itself. The tower is not a modern, climate-controlled structure. It is a nearly 1,000-year-old fortress made of stone and timber. It breathes, shifts, and settles constantly. Changes in temperature and humidity cause materials to expand and contract, creating a symphony of pops, groans, and cracks that are easily misattributed in the dead of night. Old plumbing can sound like something being dragged across a floor, and wind whistling through an arrow loop can mimic a human sigh. The very age and construction of the site provide an endless source of auditory and environmental stimuli that our pattern-seeking brains are hardwired to interpret, especially when we are already in a heightened state of awareness. This isn't to dismiss the personal experiences of the Yeoman Warders or the countless visitors. Rather, it encourages a more nuanced and critical way of engaging with the stories. The true magic of the Tower of London may not lie in proving whether ghosts are objectively real, but in understanding its incredible power to shape human experience. It stands as a monument to the blurred line between fact and feeling, where history is not just learned but felt. The chills down your spine on Tower Green are a direct connection to the past, whether they are sparked by a spirit, infrasound, or simply the awe of standing where history unfolded. The phenomena invite us to question our own perceptions and to appreciate the complex ways our minds interact with legendary locations. In the end, the tower's greatest haunting may be the enduring power of its own story, a narrative so rich and emotionally charged that it continues to captivate, terrify, and inspire us, regardless of what is objectively lurking in the shadows. Perhaps the most compelling explanation lies not in the presence of individual spirits, but in the very nature of the place itself, a perfect storm of architecture, history, and human emotion that has created an environment uniquely suited to preserving the echoes of the past. The Tower of London isn't just a building where tragic events happened. It is a vessel that has been filled to overflowing with nearly a millennium of concentrated human drama, a pressure cooker of fear, ambition, and violence whose walls seem to have absorbed the very essence of those who lived and died within them. This idea moves beyond simple ghost stories and into a fascinating hypothesis known as the stone tape theory, which suggests that powerful emotional events can somehow be recorded by their environment, particularly by materials like stone and water, and replayed under specific conditions like a supernatural recording. Think of the tower not as a haunted house but as a vast psychic battery. For centuries, it was the stage for the most intense moments of human experience, the sheer terror of a prisoner walking to the scaffold, the profound despair of a queen realizing her fate, the frantic panic of a countess fighting for her life, and the whispered conspiracies of men carving their final words into cold stone. These aren't just historical footnotes, they are events charged with immense emotional energy. The theory proposes that this energy doesn't simply dissipate. Instead, the dense, porous limestone of the White Tower and the ancient, moist masonry throughout the complex act like a natural recording medium, absorbing these emotional frequencies and storing them within their crystalline structure. Then, when the conditions are right, perhaps a specific atmospheric pressure, a certain level of humidity, or even the presence of a receptive individual, the recording plays back. This wouldn't be an intelligent spirit, but a residual echo, a moment of trauma forever trapped in a loop, which could explain the repetitive, non-interactive nature of many hauntings, like the spectral footsteps always pacing the same route or the annual replay of a desperate execution. The tower's physical design only amplifies this effect. It is a fortress designed to contain and control. Its thick walls, narrow corridors, and confined spaces weren't built for comfort or airflow. They were built to withstand siege and prevent escape. This design inherently traps energy, both physical and perhaps metaphysical. Unlike an open field where energy might scatter, the tower's labyrinthine layout seems to concentrate it, allowing these emotional imprints to build up layer upon layer over the centuries without a way to disperse. The chilling cold spots reported so frequently could be the physical manifestation of this process, a sudden, localized draining of thermal energy as the tape begins to play, pulling heat from the air to power its phantom projection. Yet, even beyond this theory, the sheer density of trauma here is almost unparalleled. This wasn't a location where one terrible event occurred. It was a purpose-built center for punishment, confinement, and death for almost 1,000 years. The weight of that sustained sorrow is immense. From a spiritual perspective, this concentration of unresolved emotion and violent death could have turned the entire site into a beacon for unrest, a place where the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond is worn dangerously thin. The raw, primal nature of the emotions experienced here, the betrayal of Sir Thomas More by the king he served, the injustice felt by Anne Boleyn, the utter terror of Catherine Howard, create a kind of spiritual resonance that refuses to fade. It's as if the stones themselves are saturated with these stories, and on quiet nights, they simply cannot help but whisper them to anyone who will listen. Whether you believe the phenomena are imprints on stone or gatherings of souls, the Tower of London stands as a profound testament to the power of place, a permanent reminder that our most intense emotions can leave a mark on the world long after we are gone. From the headless apparition of Anne Boleyn leading her silent procession to the heartbreaking whispers of the lost princes, the Tower of London holds more than just history, it holds the very echoes of those who shaped it. We've walked alongside the tragic queens, from the terrified flight of Catherine Howard to the solemn dignity of Lady Jane Grey, and felt the restless presence of men like Sir Walter Raleigh, forever pacing the confines of his long imprisonment. We've witnessed the brutal replay of Margaret Pole's horrific end, and considered the eerie intelligence of Colonel Blood's spirit, still drawn to the jewels he once tried to steal. Each story, from the grandest spectacle to the most intimate carving on a prison wall, contributes to an atmosphere so thick with memory it feels like a physical presence. This fortress is far more than a monument of stone and mortar. It is a living, breathing archive of human emotion, where joy, terror, ambition, and despair have seeped into the very foundations, creating a place where the past doesn't feel distant. It feels immediate and at times terrifyingly close. As the sun dips below the battlements and the shadows lengthen across the cobblestones, the modern world seems to fall away. The ravens settle in for the night, and the ancient walls begin to whisper their oldest secrets. It's in this quiet hour that the line between then and now feels most fragile, inviting us to listen, to feel, and to wonder. What do you think? Are these stories just legends, or is there something more lingering in the shadows of the tower? Share your own thoughts and experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into history's great